Dr. Eddie Cottle, presenting on industrial action in South Africa, 2008 to 2018. He says he's going to assist us in how to read strike statistics qualitatively. On the topics of strikes, Dr. Cottle, I'm reminded of a particular quote from the Conditions of the Working Class in England by Frederick Engels, where he had argued that strikes, at first, they appear as skirmishes, I quote, "They sometimes result in weighty struggles, but they decide nothing. It is true, but they are the strongest proof that the decisive battle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat is approaching. They are a military school of the working man in which they prepare themselves for the great struggle which cannot be avoided." Given that the series is on alternatives to capitalism, just to use my privilege, Eddie, if you permit, I hope you would entertain the question of what alternatives to strikes present in South Africa, especially given that your topic is touching on industrial action or unions, and in our current state, union density is reduced. Regarding our program, just to note that it is being recorded and it is live streamed on the SWOP YouTube. And this is how we'll proceed then for our event today. I will first introduce our speaker and then read the bio as a form of introduction. And I'll allow Eddie to have 40 minutes to present his work. And then after his presentation, Dr. Chinguno will be his interlocutor. He will have around 20 minutes. And then we'll have a 30 minutes question and answer session. And much more importantly, you will see that we are trying to keep things much more restricted. So you'll have, if you have a question or a point of clarity during the talk, you can type it in the comment box and I'll read it to the panelists during the Q&A. So just to introduce our speaker, Eddie Cottle is a postdoctoral fellow here at SWOP. He's a labor scholar and specializes in strike theory and comparative studies in social conflict. He has a long history of activism and a former trade unionist. He is the editor of the book, South Africa's World Cup, A Legacy for Whom. Over to you, Dr. Cottle. Thanks.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning if we have international guests. So thanks so much for to my colleagues for organizing this event, Tasneem and Mbuso, and the rest of my colleagues at SWOP. It's a pleasure, and I'm quite nervous presenting this topic today. I think that there is quite a lot of pressure in terms of what has taken place internationally and what has happened in the recent weeks in South Africa, where by and large labor was absent in the recent uprising, which others would say confirms the idea or notion that the spheres of struggle or class struggle has moved from labor, from the point of production into the spheres of reproduction. And this would be evidence of that. These kinds of comments or ideas, I think, are not the first to be made. They have been made time and time again in different periods of history. And I think in the or at least in 1960, a big major work was published by Ross and Hartman, where they proclaimed the withering away of the strikes. And that was based on a 20-year review of strikes globally, including South Africa. And 10 years after the book was launched, we had the major upswings in Europe in '68, and of course, followed by all over the world in the 70s and 80s, and in terms of the 90s, in the so-called less developed world. So I think in today's period in South Africa, most of the works or publications that come out are based more or less on evaluating the labor movement. And here, most of the studies center on the compositions of the trade unions, the ideas of workers and shop stewards, and also I think the kinds of bureaucratization of the labor movement. And through that, certain evaluations are made about the character of the movement. What is striking is that within these assessments, there's hardly any real kind of examination of a test of the labor movement. And when I use the word labor movement, I'm referring to workers who are both organized and unorganized workers. And the tendency is really to provide a view that this labor movement is somewhat on very, or at least extremely weak, that it hasn't been able to champion certain struggles, and it hasn't been able to take on struggles at the point of production. And my presentation to you today tries to counter that narrative. And I do so in terms of providing an evaluation from the basis of a quantitative perspective, but I do combine also the subjective analysis of the labor movement. And just to kind of be very clear, I'm not counterposing qualitative analysis over quantitative or vice versa. I'm actually calling for a combination of both. But I think, thank you for your time, and I hope that my presentation would be fruitful and we have a real great deliberation today. I'm going to now move over to my PowerPoint presentation. I think that would be much better for us to kind of all be on board, because there's a lot of quantitative material that I'm going to show and explain. Let's get there. Can everyone see that? Sure. Okay. Let me just go down there. So the aim of this presentation really is to look at the last 20 years. And I think the reason why I'm saying the last 20 years is because since 2000, the world's global economy underwent a contraction, a global contraction. And we are still in this contraction of the global economy. And this will allow us to have a really concrete understanding of how the working class has responded in both the organized and unorganized workers. A key aspect is to show how we can use a quantitative method to assist in reading the qualitative aspects of worker mobilization. And this is very crucial because when we use only a qualitative method of trying to assess, we have varied kinds of interpretation. Some saying that, the organized labor movement is no more, it has withered away. What we have today is just a skeleton of the glorious past, and so on. So a quantitative method helps to verify or dispute, or to provide a more nuanced version of what actually is transpiring. Furthermore, the quantitative method allows us also to look at strikes in relation to economic fluctuations, and also in terms of both short-term and long-term movements under capitalism, and how workers relate to the short-term and long-term movements. By using this method, I'm going to try and show why whether the labor movement is still an agent of change, which are its leading sections per industrial sector, and the shifts of this over time, including the relative performance of blue-collar workers to white-collar workers. Of course, there is a dominant view that blue-collar workers are no longer as strong as they used to be, that they're becoming less and less a significant factor within a globalized economy. And that, of course, is taking place, of those arguments, in light of the fact that white-collar workers now predominate in terms of employment relations. Finally, my main argument is that if we do not locate strike action with a long-term perspective, with an ebbs and flows of class struggle, I think that there are many mistakes to be made in short-term analysis. Let me just proceed. I'd like to start by basically background to strike statistics and how it originated. Strike statistics really arise in the 1870s, and they are actually collected by police intelligence services. And this in Europe and in America. And this was largely a response to a change in how workers started to respond to the conditions of employment, where the method of the riot was basically overtaken by the method of strike in the 1830s and 1840s, where you had major strike mobilizations continuing into the 1880s and so on. And this is really only comes to Russia much later. And the strangest thing, of course, which I stumbled across is that Lenin and Trotsky both took strike statistics very seriously in their attempt to gauge how the working class struggle is unfolding globally. In fact, Lenin was the first globally to do a comparative study on strikes, and that assisted him in his formulation, understanding the fact that the strike weapon in Russia was basically used much more widely than countries in advanced countries. And of course, this furthermore assisted him in understanding the combined and uneven nature of how workers undertake and use the strike weapon. For Lenin, he felt that strike statistics was very important for both theoretical and practical reasons. Theoretically, because for one, it allows one to see the variations among workers on a national, provincial, and international level, and therefore be able to provide some kind of theoretical framework with understanding the labor movement. And of course, practically, it means that you can set certain tasks within the workers' movement, within the workers' revolution, in a very specific time in history. But overall, he used statistics to provide a way of illuminating, as he says, every step of the great road of the working class traveling towards its worldwide goals. And of course, that was, of course, the socialist revolution. Interestingly, Trotsky also used this widely, and for those who have maybe read the history of the Russian Revolution, in chapter 3, there is a section where he deals specifically with strikes. But here again, the two leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution say that by using strike statistics, you are able to gauge and see the direction of the hidden process, and also being able to understand how the consciousness of workers are changing over time. I think the last time that Lenin writes about, at least publishes on strikes, is in 1913, that is 4 years before the Russian Revolution. So basically, I think it was used by these revolutionaries to understand the course or the path workers are taking in a very specific period. So I think for us today, I think it has also some of these theoretical implications. Nowhere are we talking about a revolutionary period, but still, we still have to understand what is the nature of the working class today, and what is its existing character of the way it is struggling today. Now, there was basically two major theories on strikes and economic fluctuations. The one was the crisis theory, and the other is the cyclical theory. The crisis theory was really predominant within the in the International during 1921, and Trotsky effectively argued against this, because the notion was that workers' upsurges and workers' strikes will dominate during periods of economic crisis. And he was arguing based on the fact that on statistical evidence, and of course, observing the events of these years, that in fact, the revival of workers actually took place during periods of economic prosperity. In other words, when the business cycle was up and not when the business cycle was down. And that helped. And the favorable conjuncture, he says, acted to reassemble the demoralized and devitalized workers where it lost their courage. And this, of course, was just the years leading up to, once again, the Russian Revolution. But his main argument here was against the version or the view in 1921 that capitalism would collapse during the next crisis. And he argued that it wouldn't collapse during the next crisis, and that this was part of the long wave of expansions and contractions of the global economy. In other words, he used long wave theory to understand the dynamics of global capitalism, and within that, to understand the location of the workers' movement and strikes. Lenin often talked about strikes and upswings and how it benefits the strike movement of workers. And here, I'm just going to give one of those quotes from him. And here he was trying to understand why the metal workers in Russia were the leading workers during the time in terms of industrial action. And his assessment of studying strike statistics and looking at economic fluctuations, he concluded there was no doubt that the relatively more favorable market conditions in 1912 facilitated the strike struggle of the metal workers. And what is interesting thing is about Mbuso's introduction, which I think is a fantastic one, because this notion of worker struggles increasing or strike frequency increasing during periods of upswings was already there in the first major document of Engels, the conditions of the working class in England, which was then taken up by Marx and subsequently by Lenin and Trotsky. But coming in terms of the 20th century or the mid or the late 20th century, the interest in looking at strike statistics or even economic fluctuations disappeared from those in terms of the more progressive milieu thinkers, Marxists, or whoever you are, and has become really the purview of economists. And that's the most fascinating thing. In fact, if you read business cycle evaluations in the South African Reserve Bank, you will find some reference to strikes and the business cycle as well. And even today, there are more and more of these kinds of evaluations with economists, including South African economists, but not by sociologists or those in political science or those in the broader progressive movement. But just to kind of sum up what then is the take on economic fluctuations and strikes. And this definition I'm giving you now, which is derived from Lenin, has actually become the more mainstream economics definition of viewing strikes. And the argument really is during economic contraction, worker struggles become defensive. They hold on to what they already have, which is employment, wages, and the existing working conditions. In times of a boom, workers take the offensive, they demand more than what they have. And that, of course, I think is a more obvious one, where workers feel that because there is an expansion of production or the sales, employers are more reluctant not to provide those increases or make concessions, because these are periods in which they make the most profit. And so the conclusion of Marxists generally was that this is a general tendency, it's not a law, for strikes to be pro-cyclical. But I think as years passed, and I think in terms of the period where we entered social democracy, the industrial relation systems tended to act as a counter tendency to strike action. And so we have to take account in the new features of how the capitalist system is dealing with the conflict between capital and labor. And I'll touch on this more clearly as I go on into the presentation. I just want to touch on very briefly on strikes and business cycles in South Africa. The blue really represents, can we see there? My mouse seems to have disappeared. Oh, it's not moving there. The blue is GDP growth, and the orange here is strike movements. And of course, if you look at the major strikes in South Africa, we can see here 1973, which is the peak there. It correlates, or basically is synchronizing with a major growth. Many people argue that South Africa contracted in 1972, but actually started contracting only in 1974. And this is when the Durban strikes, the famous Durban strikes, happen. And the same with the 1980s waves. We can see here basically a gradual upward movement during the 80s. And this is the interesting thing about capitalist dynamic of growth, is that within long periods of contraction, you can also have spurts of economic growth, while the broad tendency of the broader economy is to decline. And so in 1987, we can see the 1987 strike. Miners' strike happens really at the height of an upswing of the business cycle. And you can actually verify these through business cycle reports in your Reserve Bank reports to basically locate the timing of all these major strikes and upswings. And here we can see as the economy moves down to its lowest point of contraction, the strikes start to move down, and it's a downward spiral. And this one here, I think, is more an outlier, marks the entry of the public sector workers, having basically celebrating the new founded rights during the LRA. When we come to the 2000, which is more a focus period from 2000 to 2018, it appears as if the strike levels are now back to the 1960s. And this is where we must be very careful when we look at strikes, is that when you look at the 60s, you're looking at plant level strike measurements. And when you look at from the post-apartheid period, you're really looking at plant level, but of course, the major change was the industrial relations system, and with institutionalized collective bargaining, and with agreements tending to take up to 3 years. So that was some of the changes, which is very, very important for understanding what has happened now. Okay, coming to the quantitative and qualitative dimensions of how we understand them as distinctive from how I would say the economists would use these indices of strikes. Now, in terms of a lot of the kinds of progressive thinking on strikes, the argument really is that significant quantitative increases in strikes would signal qualitative changes in working class consciousness. I know that's a very difficult thing to measure, but I think let's look at how we can look at that more clearly in a concrete level. So normatively, one would talk about F or N for number of strikes or strike frequency. And that's how the Department of Labor uses the concepts, including the International Labor Organization. They will use F for strike frequency, D for days lost, and here they would say days lost to production. And then S would be strikers. And in terms of the way Lenin looked at these things, and I think he was the first really to kind of provide a qualitative label to some of these indices. So he started off with really looking at days lost to production. And there he argued that if you look at days lost to production and the length of time different workers would stay out of work, that would mean that they are very persistent, or that there would be the more persistent workers. So whether a worker strikes for a week or 2 weeks or 4 weeks or a month or 3 months, the more they would be on strike, and the more the days lost increase, that would mean that those workers are the most persistent workers. And he used this measure to identify who the vanguard is of the workers' movement in particular, because these workers were the ones who were the most prepared to make sacrifices and challenge the capitalist system. The other indice was strikers, and he argued that I think, including Trotsky, that when there is a significant quantitative change in terms of the mass of workers coming out in strike, that would indicate that there has been a change in consciousness, because what you have now is a situation where at hundreds of percent more or 200% more of workers are prepared now to actually embark on strike action, whereas in the last 5 years or 10 years, workers were not willing to come out on strikes. But more closely, if you want to examine the more qualitative aspect of work mobilization using this quantitative indices, and then actually studying what is actually happening in those years that you're looking at strikes, the key things that I think resemble a family, and this you can actually use in different periods or even in different periods of history of strikes. And you'll find that the relationship with significant quantitative increase, you will find that there are very significant qualitative changes in the way that there are, for example, changes in strike tactics, whether workers just go on strike as permanent workers, where it's only seasonal workers, or whether they go out as a general strike, or whatever the tactic is that they are using. There are changes in how they coordinate their struggle, whether at plant level or industry level or regional level or at multi-union level or at federation level. That there are new ideas and policies that workers are demanding, which are distinct from prior years, that strikes are now happening in industries where strikes didn't happen before, or where they did was very, I would say, minuscule. And then, of course, the introduction of changes in economic and political demands. So one could actually use both of these dimensions to try and get a more holistic picture of what is actually happening within the working class. Okay, let me just go through now briefly what happened over the last 20 years. I think from this graph here, from about 2000, we can see that the curve, which I call the curve of the class struggle, shows an upward trend. And that, of course, is in contrast to what is the predominant view of labor, that in fact that, you know, there's little engagement in terms of strike action. And there's little, I think, also analysis of all the different types of strikes. So in South Africa, there was a definite trend for an upward trend in strikes. And I think I'll start off with an analysis here, because here you can see that there is a downswing from 2000 to 2004. And the argument made here by the Department of Labor essentially was that the reason for this downward trend from 2000 was that the Labor Relations Act had basically kicked in, that bargaining became much more predictable with centralized bargaining and negotiated agreements. And because of that, they will be able to have a much more proactive role in terms of ensuring the bargaining process or the that there was a significant improvement in dispute resolution processes. And the most interesting thing about this is by 2004, because they could observe a downward trend, the Department of Labor says in its 2004 report, one can only expect a lower level of industrial action in 2005. And of course, they were completely wrong. In fact, what we have in 2005 really is an episodic moment. It is the beginning of the intensification of industrial conflict in South Africa, despite the foundation or having inaugurated a new industrial labor system. And I just want to talk about the 2005 wave and why I think it's very important. I think why it's important for me is that there's often an assessment made of trade unions or individual affiliates of the various federations. And often these evaluations are, I could say, somewhat negative, I suppose for some good reason, but to some extent, they are also written off in terms of contributing to labor resistance. And the most interesting thing for me was that the trigger for this wave came from the Food and Allied Workers Union, probably one of the most or weakest affiliates of COSATU. And they started a national strike in the food and canning industry, which later then spread to other industries as well. And so for 2005, you had strikes in all the industries with the exception of construction. And construction comes in 2006 because of the preparations for the World Cup. But what is most fascinating about this event is that the entry of food workers and FAO's membership also extends into the agricultural area. So we're having farm workers coming on strike. We also have strikes at the Cape fishing factories. And in these strikes, the trade unions were trying to unify, I think for the first time really, workers who were casual, seasonal, and permanent, to try and unify them in struggle, to ensure that they were fighting for parity in pay, and also the tendency was to fight for permanent employment. But the main aim of the strikes since 2005 was to increase wages for workers at the bottom end of the spectrum, which we call the general worker. Another interesting thing about 2005, which is distinctive, qualitatively distinctive, is that we had the 90,000 worker strike from the gold mining, which was the first time the gold mining workers had come out on strike. 18 years since the defeat of the 1987 miners' strike. We also had the SAA, South African Airways strike, and so on and so on. And what was interesting about this wave, furthermore, was that it was a generalized response to cost cutting. Cost cutting in the form of planned outsourcing, protesting flexible forms of employment, protesting changes to piecework, and the end of casual work, which I've already stated. So the character of these strikes were markedly different from the strikes of the prior periods, which provides us with the clues to its qualitative dimensions. And of course, over here we see 2007 was a major upswing involving the public sector workers and including the construction workers. The thing I want to just highlight here, up to 2007, it's a very important one. From about 1999 to about 2007, South Africa experienced its longest upswing in its business cycle, which lasted 8 years. And that helped to propel the workers into action, to provide a lever for them to engage us. And similarly, one can then see, coming here, I've lost the mouse, okay, there. This is very interesting. Furthermore, 2008, 2009. This is the Great Depression of the 21st century. And we can see that strikes are at the lowest level in terms of the trend going forward. And this once again confirms the cyclical perspective on strikes. And then we have the upswing of the business cycle. And that goes from 2009 to basically 2013, which is over here. All right. And here we have the entry of public sector workers once again, 20 million days lost. That tells us that, of course, the trend is also one of increase in persistence level. Workers are more determined to win the demands. The peak of the determination level is in 2010, after which it recedes and declines. So we have a trend of an upswing in strikes, and we have a trend where the persistence levels start to decline. And I just want to talk a bit about that, but just to note also that the Marikana takes place and the Farmworkers Uprising takes place here, both on the upswing of a major cycle, and the platinum strike and the metal worker strike takes place in a downswing of the business cycle. So here we have somewhat of a counter-cyclical swing, right? And that points to a relative autonomy of workers in industrial action. But during this downswing, economic downswing over here, I'll show later that fewer and fewer workers are in struggle. And of course, the determination levels drops significantly. Okay. So what does this tell us in terms of days lost? That we are somewhat back to 2000 levels in terms of levels of determination. And the reason why you have a significant difference between strike frequency and strike determination is because strike determination depends a lot on the enormous financial resources and sacrifices workers make during strike action. Whereas with strikes, you can, of course, also embark on short-term strikes, which is happening here in the last period. You can see these are short-term strikes because the amount of days lost is smaller. So what has happened over those 10-year period, essentially from 2005 to 2014, 2015, is that we are seeing basically a retreat of workers because there is an exhaustion of having embarked on strike action for a period of 10 years. Now, 10 years might seem small, but it's basically equivalent to, for example, the 1905 revolution from beginning to end, basically, in terms of when Rosa Luxemburg investigated the length of time in which the entire phase took place of that revolutionary process. So it's a very long time for workers, and they become exhausted, and the strike determination level drops. And a lot of commentators often point to this to say, well, can you see the workers, when we need them, they're not coming into falling into strike action. But of course, my argument really is we must be able to look at this as the ebb and flow of the labor movement, and not look at it just in terms of the years that we are viewing the strike action. In terms of the number of strikers, this is very interesting. Or the interesting part here is that the trend seemed always to be going downward, despite fluctuations of days lost going up over here, and the trend of strikes increasing as well. But nevertheless, what it does tell us is that the masses of workers haven't come out in a way that we would expect them to have if we do want to compare them to the 80s. And my argument is that you cannot compare workers in the 80s to workers who are now in the 21st century. But nevertheless, this is still a great amount of workers. And I think the reason why you also have then the slide down here as well is that much of the workers' demands were being met as the strike waves proceeded. And what was significant during this period was that the lower end demand of workers for increases did take place. Workers did receive above inflation increases. And if one does want to make a comparison between the 80s and the current period, in fact, this period, despite this downward trend in strikers, saw an increase in the wage share back to 42% by 2013. I suspect it's dropped again post that period. The level of consciousness in terms of strikers. I think that what we saw that the change of consciousness has been going on a downward trend between 2005 to 2014, but not at a great level. But it seems to be increasing again from 2016 to 2018. and in line with the increases in strike action. And I just want to note something very, very quickly here is that the reason why you have a decline also in days lost and increase in strike action tells us that workers in smaller industries have now gone into strike action, and that workers in larger industries are no longer more that active in industrial action. Okay, so that means basically what we are observed or have observed in the last few years is a general retreat of the mass workers in strike action, and that I said it must be understood within the ebb and flow of struggle. More recently, we found that there has been significant increases in wildcat or unprotected strikes. And this, of course, is by both unorganized and organized labor. The statistics, unfortunately, do not tell us what proportion of the strikes were from unorganized or organized workers. But I think one of the more interesting facts is that for the first time, we have a double digit in terms of proportion of days lost attributed to unorganized workers. And that is very, very significant, because up to now, the most persistent struggles have been fought by organized labor and not by unorganized labor. And so most of the demands that have been won have been in terms of, have been in the sphere of organized workers until the farm workers uprising and so on. Okay, I'm quickly going to go to industry level. I know my time is up. I'm just going to go very, very quickly there. The most interesting part of the current period, or at least the 21st century, is that public sector workers, which is here community services, are the most, have the highest strike frequency in the country. So they are the ones who embark on the most strike action, followed by manufacturing, then mining workers, and then transport workers. But when you take all the share of strikes collectively and divide it up between what is traditionally white-collar industries and blue-collar industries, one finds that blue-collar industries make up 65.4% of all strikes over the entire period, over the 20-year period. And that is a significant finding, because it disputes the narrative that blue-collar workers are no longer an important agent of change. Okay. In terms of days lost per industry, per 1,000 employees, mining comes out as the most significant contributor to days lost, followed by the public sector, and then it is transport. Again, transport comes in, followed by manufacturing. And thus, we can see is that manufacturing workers are no longer as persistent as they were in the 20th century. Of course, one can then go on and then do examine why that is the case. You can blame the leadership or other things, or the trade union, but there's much more forces at work than just trade unions. Okay, in terms of the last 20 years, what are the major shifts in terms of ranking, in terms of persistence levels? I think for me, one of the most outstanding issues is the fact that transport and agricultural workers have moved up the ladder, with manufacturing dropping to 4th place. But on the whole, throughout the entire 20-year period, mining sector has remained at the number 1 place. But the public sector is just losing its place to the transport sector. And that gives, I think, for us, an indicator of where much of the industrial action is happening, some of which is not documented. And the interesting thing for me here is the showing of the agricultural workers as a major force in strike action, because in the 20th century, there wasn't much of that action, including the early 20th century as well. Okay, In terms of what can we take out from the entire presentation, I think that the one important thing is that we can take is that all strikes matter, no matter how small they are, because although you can have a major union leading a strike by a few workers in a particular industry can be a turning point for the labor movement. You can take, for example, the Marikana, where a smaller section of the mining workers undertook a struggle, or we can look at the farm workers struggle, which for me is one of the most significant strikes in the 21st century, because it's the first mass strike in the 21st century South Africa, which triggered an uprising in both the arenas of production, in production and at the point of reproduction as well, a unity. Another reason why all strikes matter is that it was through the farm worker struggle that we had the change in legislation and the reduction of the national minimum wage as well. So I think that's basically the crux of what I had to say today. I hope it made sense, and I look forward to the deliberations. Thank you very much. Oops.
Thanks a lot, Eddie, for the presentation. I have to say, and I'm sure many will agree with me, that it is methodologically detailed and quite theoretically rich presentation, and it presents, I think, I like the particular view on locating it within the ebbs and flows of working class struggle when looking at strikes. Now I'm going to introduce the interlocutor for today, Dr. Crispen Chinguno. Dr. Crispen Chinguno is a senior lecturer at Saltplatch University in Kimberley, and he has a PhD in sociology from the University of the Witwatersrand. His academic and research interest emerged from his work experience as a worker activist. His experience from the world of work and in trade union movement posed a number of intellectual challenges, which later diverted him to academia. His principal research interests explore questions on labor, work, decent work, the future of work, society, and employment and power relations. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Chinguno. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Muso, and good afternoon, colleagues. Thanks, Eddie, for sort of like quite a very sort of like refreshing way of trying to understand how to read strike. I think that's a very interesting sort of like, thank you very much for that. So I sort of like, in a way, would like sort of like to start off by sort of like drawing on what, taking on from what Eddie has sort of like highlighted. I think you sort of like, when you're looking at strike actions, they're quite very important in terms of indicating as a manifestation of the contestation between labor and capital within the employment relationship. So when you look at it from the South African context, the role of the working class, the role of the workers in the working class, it was sort of like, in a way, very much connected to the broader struggle in the broader society. And sort of like, in a way, that is sort of like, in a way, from the days of the struggle for struggle against apartheid, sort of like, in a way, the trade union taking a central role, the working class and the trade unions taking a central role in the struggle for the democratic, sort of like, in a way, democratic transition. So there's sort of like, in a way, there's always been sort of like a connection between the struggles in the broader society and the struggles at the shop floor. So the question now is sort of like, in a way, how do we read that now, 27 years after the democratic, like, in a way, democratic transition? So, but what is important in a way, it's sort of like, in a way, for us to be able to look closely at the strikes, and how do we sort of like, in a way, draw meaning from those strikes, and then how, for example, do they represent continuities and discontinuities in terms of maybe how we have been trying to understand the the workers and the working class, like in a way, the working class struggle. But it is important to note that from the outset, to note that when we talk about the strike action, it sort of like in a way represents the sort of like in a way that manifestation of the struggle, of the conflict between labor, which is inherent within sort of like in a way within an employment relationship. So when you look at the history, looking at it from the drawing from the South African context, also looking at the idea in other contexts, I think we would sort of like in a way take note that the way that sort of like in a way capitalism as a system sort of like in a way has evolved over time, whereby the capitalism, it sort of like in a way has been able to find ways of accommodating or striking a compromise between the capital and if you put it that way, the working class through the trade union. So where you find that the capitalism sort of like in a way, I would sort of like in a way draw a particular example from the South African case, where you find that this conflict, in a way, capitalism has tried to find ways in terms of through striking compromises with the parties within the working, between capital and labor. They sort of like in a way have been some form of accommodation over time. You look at it sort of, so the question to Eddie is sort of like in a way, in trying to read strikes, should we be talking about working class, the rise in terms of working class consciousness, or does this represent a crisis in the ways that capitalism is able to accommodate conflict between labor and capital? So does it sort of like in a way, because when you look at it, for example, you can sort of like in a way, does that sort of like in a way represent a consciousness, or it's sort of like in a way, it's a crisis in the way that capitalism, it's sort of like in a way, manage sort of like in a way conflict. So I'm trying to draw here, sort of like in a way, drawing on maybe if you draw the Gramscian lenses whereby we see that capitalism, it sort of like in a way has been able to manufacture consent in a way that it has become hegemonic, where the workers and the working class themselves, they are sort of like in a way, they become accommodated within this sort of like within this system through the various ways in which capitalism is able to manufacture sort of like in a way, to manufacture consent, or to manufacture sort of like in a way class compromise. I will take an example like what happened at the strike, the general strikes. It's sort of like, you know, the strike waves in Marikana, 2012 all the way to 2014. Should we see that as a rise in terms of working class consciousness, or in a way we can also be able to read it in a way as a form of a crisis in the way that capitalism is able to manufacture consent? In this way, the crisis in terms of institutionalization, you find where when you look at what happened at the Platinum Belt, you find that the NUM had got to a point where it had become a very strong sort of like in a way trade union that was able to manufacture consent. And over time, that sort of like that mechanism, that system of manufacturing consent, the union become co-opted and become captured. And then it compromises the capacity of the union for it to be able to manufacture consent. And that creates a crisis. And then that crisis, in a way, that crisis in the manufacture of consent resulted in the strikes. And then that results sort of like in a way that results in the strikes that happened in 2012, 2014. And we see a reconfiguration in the institutions of industrial relations. This reconfiguration happens in many ways, including even disbandment or the rejection of the union at the NUM, and bringing in a new union which comes in the form of AMCO, which becomes a new agent of manufacturing consent. I'm just trying to sort of like to pose a question to Eddie here. So we see that sort of like in a way, the new union that comes in So we are back to where we were in terms of with the NUM sort of like in a way being unable to manufacture consent as an institution of manufacturing consent. And then that resulted in that culminated in a strike action, and then that resulted in its displacement by AMCO. So AMCO, but the argument here is sort of like in a way, you would see that of course the strike starting off organized by the workers outside the formal institutions of industrial relations. But over time, unfortunately, capitalism also being able, the very same institutions of capitalism, the union in the form of the union this time, the unions being able to capture that working class struggle and taking the workers back to the negotiating table through AMCO. And then we are back to where we are in a way that the consent that was manufactured, that the NUM could not manufacture, and now the bourgeoisies are able to get that through AMCO into the sort of like in a way in the current context. So the question here is sort of like in a way, are we talking about the crisis in terms of the rise in terms of workers' consciousness, or we can also read this very same way in a way that it represents a crisis in the forms of the institutions of manufacturing, of manufacturing consent. And then the other question, sort of like when you look at the statistics that Eddie has sort of like in a way posed, quite very, very, very interesting and a very illuminating and very refreshing way to try to transpose, to try to understand the quantitative data of strike, and at the same time also trying to understand the qualitative, put them together, and then try to draw meanings from that. But the question that comes in a way is sort of like in a way, since strike actions represent the highest level of the conflict between labor and capital. So the big question is like, which is a question to a very Marxian sort of like way of trying to understand industrial relations. At what point does this conflict sort of like in a way translate? How do we sort of like in a way, how do we know at what point does this conflict translate to this action that becomes sort of like in a way, that's the question that sort of like in a way, that sort of like in a way, how can we address the question in terms of at what point does this conflict translate into this, what becomes sort of like in a way, what becomes sort of like in a way class action. But when you look at it in a way, should we not see this more as a crisis in terms of the institutions of manufacturing consent? And also the other question is sort of like coming in from a history where there is a connection between, there's always been a connection between the struggles at the workplace and the struggles in the broader society. So the question is to Eddie, how do these struggles that we're seeing now, how do they connect to the struggles in the broader society? Is there some form of continuity from what it was in the past, or there is sort of like in a way, there's a break in terms of maybe how we should understand this in terms of how the struggles in the workplace, how, you know, in what ways are they informed by the struggles in the broader society? And then that distinction whereby there's always been sort of like an attempt to try to distinguish between the space of production and the space of reproduction. I think it's quite very important, but it's also quite very interesting, especially looking at in other sort of like sectors of the economy. Now that in this current context of this pandemic, that those boundaries between the space of reproduction and production, they are also almost, COVID-19 is almost like disbanded them again. We are back to, in some sectors, with exceptional case, in some sectors, especially those white collar, for some white collar workers, they sort of like in a way, that space between production and reproduction, it's sort of like in a way, they become sort of like in a way, the way that capitalism is reorganized in light of the context of the pandemic. Capitalism will reorganize itself, whereby that divide between the space of production and reproduction is not so clear now at the moment, given that a lot of the white collar workers, those who can at least work from home. So that poses a question also in terms of maybe how we should sort of like in a way try to understand that. So then when we look at I think quite interesting, the question that like the farm workers the strikes, I think that is quite sort of like in a way, quite very interesting in the way that they has always been, when you look at the history of the farm workers in South Africa, very much excluded from from the national industrial relations framework in the way that until up to the 1994, the farm workers were sort of like in a way excluded outside the institution, these very same institutions of the industrial relations. But what is quite interesting is that although there's been an attempt to try to accommodate them into these institutions of industrial relations by allowing trade unions, collective bargaining, it has been very much little, there's been very much little change in terms of, we look at the statistics, there's still very much low levels in terms of unionization. When you look at the farm workers in South Africa, you'll find that it's still very much, there are other structural factors that the institute, the process, that very same process of trying to institutionalize the relations. But the question is sort of like in a way, but we also need to understand that the struggles that the farm workers, I don't know, should we not read them as much as very much connected to the broader struggles to the broader struggles in terms of when you look at it, it brings in the question around the land question, for example, the question around the land question, the question around the question around the land question. So you sort of like in a way, I think that the farm workers sort of like in a way struggles may sort of like in a way be pointing to maybe some continuities in terms of maybe how the struggles they work at the workplace is very much sort of like is very much informed or very much connected to that in the broader broader society. And then but I sort of like in a way, so when you look at it, so my to conclude, if I don't know how much time that I still have, but when you look at it in a way that what especially in different sectors in terms of maybe what has happened in the different sectors, the mining sector, for example, it's quite, I'm sort of like in a way, it's very, the way that we can read it, the way that we should see it more as the crisis in terms of the institutionalization of the industrial, the structures of institutionalization of industrial relations, because although the workers, the strike from the onset, at the onset, it was more about the workers organizing themselves. But unfortunately, what happened after that, it's sort of like in a way, there was some form of accommodation in the way that the workers end up going to a union, an alternative sort of like unions for their voice, trying to be accommodated within the very same sort of like institutions of industrial, sort of like in a way, industrial relations. So in a way, it is also important to try to see this in a way that it's more like representing a crisis in terms of the industrial, a crisis in terms of the mechanism to which capitalism is able to manufacture is concerned. One that is fixed, then we are back to where we are. And then that is it sort of like works in a very cyclical way. Like now, when you look at the platinum belt, for example, you see that with the crisis with the NUM, because it could not be able to manufacture consent, and then we had the big strikes, and then became displaced by AMCO, and then there's also now that maybe over time this AMCO also get to a point where it is not able to manufacture consent. Then there's another big strike again. It becomes, and then that system sort of like in a way moves on and on, sort of like in a way in a very cyclical sort of like in a very cyclical sort of like way. So in a way that at the end of the day, we sort of like in a way we are not bound to sort of like in a way to see that sort of like in a way that becoming sort of like in a way form of class consciousness, whereby the workers will come together and the working class try to challenge sort of like capitalism, but it's more about sort of like in a way about accommodation and be able to fit in the system. And then thereafter, And then the cycle continues over and over again and over and over again. So I sort of like, in a way, I would like to end it there so that at least we can open up for a discussion. But thank you very much, Eddie. And I'll be looking forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Crispen, for the comments. Musa, how do we proceed from here?
Thank you. Let me just give you 2 minutes or so, or 3, to respond to some of the 3 questions, I think that, or 4 questions that Crispen has raised. And then I am going to read the Q&A from the attendees, and then allow both of you to respond to the questions if there are any addressed to Crispen or you. So thanks.
Okay. No, thanks. These are very big questions and responses, and some of the areas need some more work. But the question really is, how does one, in a sense, label the nature of worker consciousness during the current period, where capital often tries to accommodate workers? Now, if you look at from the period 2005 to about 2015, one could argue that the consciousness is nowhere in the entire period revolutionary or even pre-revolutionary, because one can take maybe cue from the demands of the workers and what they are trying to tell us about what they are struggling over. And so most of the demands were about casualization into flexible labor, increase in wages, and in terms of maintaining employment within the companies. And that, I think, for me, although you could argue that that is normal worker consciousness, what makes it distinct really is that it was a period, in an episodic moment, where workers actually challenged capital and made great efforts. Some of them were violent, some of them, of course, were militant. So it's not revolutionary, but I would definitely say that it did have an episodic militant consciousness that emerged over that period. And I think that the unions, of course, do play the role of, on the one hand, trying to manufacture consent, and on the other hand, they also play the role of manufacturing discontent. That's their role as managers throughout, I think, history. And I think the same thing for here. I think what was strikingly lacking from the trade union movement was, once Marikana and the farm workers uprising happened, the only entity that actually understood that moment was the economic freedom fighters, and they took the gap. Whereas I think the federations and otherwise didn't understand that the point then was to unify the farm workers and the rest of the workers, including the mine workers, or led by farm workers and mine workers, and have some kind of convention with them, or some kind of thing. And that was interesting because you must remember that farm workers uprising in the Western Cape was, in a sense, a revolt of the system. I mean, it stunned the entire Western Cape. It stunned the communities. It stunned capital. It was a big, big fright. So in no way was it part of an ordinary way of collective bargaining, even though it started out as such by a group of 300 seasonal workers. And that, I think, is a fascinating thing about how strikes can trigger major uprising and so on. So I do not then maybe look at much of NUM's role. I think NUM, historically, I worked for NUM for 7 years in the construction sector, and there was always a bottleneck with the tops, not actually with the rest of the officials. And that, I think, is a way I think we must understand some of the dynamics in the labor movement, and how there is a tension consistently within these unions, and at some point the bubble bursts and there's a rebellion within the ranks of the movement. I'm not in favor of separating point of production and point of reproduction as the way I think many do, because workers themselves are part of these communities. And I think if one wants to create a separation between the two, then one, I think, would in the short term maybe be correct to say, well, things have moved over to the point of reproduction, but the long term, I don't think so. And if you look at South Africa's movements, I think what you have really is oscillations between the sphere of production and reproduction. So example, between 2000 and 2005, that's essentially the entry of the social movements in this country, and the anti-privatization movement, the TAC, and those kinds of organizations, when there is a kind of, I would say, a contraction in terms of strike frequency. And I think similarly now, during the recent period, where the resistance went over to reproduction, when labor itself was in a retreat. Of course, my argument would have been, or my expectation was, that at some point, those two could have come together. But of course, history says otherwise in terms of the current relationships. How the pandemic plays out, I think, look, it's a rough period. There would be, I think, it's a bad time for organized labor. But I think as the unrest has shown, and my view is really that with the next, as soon as the economy pulls out post-COVID, labor movement would come back into action more fiercely over time. I'm not too clear, and I don't think I'll be able to answer quite right now what the pandemic is going to do to the current workers that are working at home. I do know that a lot of companies are calling their workers back to the office right now. So I think that the strikes, in a way, I think is that you're correct, Crispen, to say that the structural issues play a huge role in terms of how workers are responding. And I think from 2000 onwards was, of course, the phase of long-term decline of capitalist growth. And that led itself to a massive attempt by capital for reductions or cost-cutting measures. And those cost-cutting measures, of course, were a bit too much for the workers to withstand. And that's how I think we had these strike waves emerging. I hope I've attempted to do justice to those thoughts and questions of yours, Crispen.
Thanks, Eddie, and also thanks, Crispen, for those brilliant questions. So now what I'm going to do is read from the Q&A and the comments. Much more, I have 2 points from Isan, which are clarity seeking. So Isan is asking, is the growth nominal or real when you're looking at growth? He's saying, my understanding is that inflation was very high during this high growth period, which would explain both high nominal growth and high strikes. And then Isan is also asking, do we know anything about the success of the increased number of strikes in the 2015 to 2020 period, whilst the days were low?
Sorry, can you just repeat that question?
Oh, you didn't hear that, sorry. Yeah. Do we know anything about the success of the increased number of strikes in the 2015 to 2020 period, in brackets, whilst the days lost was low? And then we also have a question from Carl van Holt. Carl is asking, what is the relationship between a strike wave and a more political or revolutionary period of struggle? If strike waves tend to correlate to a period of a capitalist growth, don't revolutionary periods correspond to periods of capitalist decline when employment, wages, living conditions all decline? Is there a distinction between strike waves and revolutionary periods? And then we also have a question from Edward Webster. Thanks for the presentation. Do you have any sense of the days lost and number of strikes amongst platform workers, for example, Uber Eats or Uber? Thank you. And then, so I'll allow you to take that, and then we'll go for another round. I think that should be sufficient. Is that okay, Eddie?
Yeah, sure.
And thanks for everyone.
Yeah. Look, the growth rates are real, and there is a correspondence to high inflation, of course, yeah, in terms of high growth. But high growth is also a period, or high inflation is also a period where the capitalists tend to make most of their profits. And so workers do have more power in terms of being able to win demands during those periods. So in terms of reading, I've read obviously every single report coming from the Department of Labor, which I feel is fairly accurate, actually, if you assess them. And the reading I got from those reports was that labor was generally successful in increases or getting real increases in wages during that period. And when you look at other reports, also other statistical reports, and some economists who are looking at changes in the wage share and profit share, there was a definite change in that balance between the wage share and profit share in favor of workers. And I think that would be a much more broader indicator of the relative strength of worker during that period, that it actually did gain some traction, where of course it lost a lot. Of course, it's ending labor brokers, casualization, and so on. But the interesting fact, if you look at the labor market reviews, you'll find that there was in line with this upswing from about 2005 going right through to 2017 at least, a change in employers starting to employ the casual workers on full-time, even prior to the legislation being changed. And that I found quite striking as well. And that's actually not new. I mean, if you take the struggles of workers in the 70s, even under conditions of contraction of the company, what did employers do? With all the migrant workers and casual workers and so on, was to employ them on a permanent basis, okay, and incorporate them, as my colleague is trying to say, find some accommodation for resistance, because there's only, I think, some ways in which capital realizes it can actually maintain the kind of structural blockages it imposes on workers to meet some demand. So that is something very interesting, and I think worthwhile reading is those reports coming from Stats SA on the conversion of casual workers as well. Thank you for wonderful questions also in terms of the issue of strike waves. Strike waves occur regardless of a long swing, upswing, or downswing under capitalism. And if one looks at just I mean, I could have taken out some of the statistics, but I think it'll be too much trouble right now. If you take the strike data from 1996 upwards until about 2000, you will still be able to observe strike waves, especially in the period where workers were exercising their newfound freedoms, to strike, public sector coming out, and so on. So that is a very interesting phenomenon that occurred during a long, expansive phase lasting, I think it was a 13-year wave of expansion of capitalism in South Africa before the contraction actually began. However, there is, I think, distinction I make is that you do have strike waves, but there is a distinction between a strike wave and a revolutionary wave. And the revolutionary waves would, so far my observation and my research, would occur in the phase of the long wave of contraction of capitalism, I would say. So example, from 2000 until the current period, these are the times in which you'd find the possibility of revolutionary waves, but they did not occur in South Africa as yet. They found a different expression as mass strikes in Egypt and elsewhere. So you can have strike waves occurring in a long-term upswing and downswing. And as I tried to show that even in a long phase of contraction, which is about 20 years on average, give and take, of capitalism, you can have these sudden bursts of accumulation or growth. And one can see and observe that the spurts of strike waves or growth, and even the revolutionary wave of the 80s, occurs within a period of high growth within a long-term contraction. So it is not a mechanical, I would say, reasoning, because you still have to make way for the fact that a major upsurge can happen in a period of a downturn. But my reading of South Africa's history, and a reading of 120 strikes that I've studied so far, about 65% of major strikes happen on the upswing of the business cycle. Unfortunately, Comrade Eddie, the problem right now, I think, that there isn't such data that I've come across at the moment. Maybe I would correspond with my friends at the Department of Labor and ask them what they are doing about this and see what information I could gather. But I must confess, from my side, I have not yet looked at this work, which I think you are looking at. So I'm sorry, I'm not able to answer that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie, and thanks for the questions once again. I have a question from Karin Ranseman. She has 3 questions, and she says, thanks for the presentation, Eddie, and I'm going to read the 3 questions for you. Question 1, it seems that you have drawn your data from the Department of Labor or Department of Labor reports. Can you say something about the quality of this data in terms of how the reports are compiled and the extent to which employers can be relied upon to actually supply the information for these reports? In my view, the quality of the report is extremely variable, and the reports themselves note the difficulties they have in getting employers to report. And question 2, which is related to 1, if you compare the strike stats between something like the SAPS IRIS data, there's a big gap between the number of strikes and labor-related protests, which is in the thousands for much of the same period. We suggest some of the gap in the reporting. My experience is that some workers will protest and down tools over immediate workplace issues, technical and unprotected strike, but neither the workers nor the employers regard it as such. So what can these stats from the Department of Labor then not tell us? And then the last one, it's on terminology. You call striking workers outside of a union unorganized. But surely these workers are non-unionized and not unorganized. To go on strike, you have to be, by definition, almost organized. So that's that. If any of the attendees have questions, they can also post them on the Q&A. So let me allow you to answer the 3. Please unmute.
Okay, thanks very much to Karen for those questions. I think they're very good questions. I'll start with the last one. Yes, I think you're correct. It's really non-unionized. I think we probably have to find a better term overall for capturing the essence of the workers. And I think that in terms of these workers, much more work has to be done in terms of being able to capture statistically what is happening there. And I think I tried to highlight that when I made my presentation about the weakness of the current data, which is for the recent period from the Department of Labor, doesn't sufficiently cover what is actually transpiring there. But I think it does provide us with I think a more or less, I think a more viable gauge from where to draw from and to understand what is happening. I don't think any set of statistics will be complete. I note, various criticism on Beverly Silver's database as well, where she incorporates data, strike data, labor protests, and a range of things, and that method has also had its constraints as well. My engagement with the Department of Labor and also my assessment of my own reading of strikes, and having gone through strikes myself as well, I found that they are relatively reliable if you want to have a take of what is happening over those existing years. I don't think it distorts, in terms of the level of error, what has transpired in the year. But I think that there's room for improvement. I have corresponded with them to ask for some improvements, including of how the categories of data. I've even requested them to break down the data into male and female strikers, for example, which was very, very important to understand. So my own work is really to do, I think, with what you're trying to say here, is to kind of overcome some of those gaps in the way the reporting is done and what is actually captured there. In terms of the employers, can you trust them? Can you trust them? Well, what I do really is, if you look at what the Department of Labor is reporting in terms of, let's say, a major public sector strike, and what figures they give in their report, and then I do a search like everyone else, and I look at people reporting on it, or I ask a unionist of what actually transpired here. Do you think these figures are correct, or they're not correct, and so on. So I think there's, of course, a constant process of verification, and I think it is a job that is required to be done, so that we have even better material and better methods of how to do this, so that we have a better assessment of what is actually happening within labor movement in terms of non-unionized and unionized workers. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. We are at 3:30, which is the end of the webinar. So let's see. I don't think there are any other questions. I wanted to ask from you as panelists if you have any closing remarks, and then I will then say goodbye to everyone. Thanks. Let me give it to you.
Okay. Well, I just want to maybe say something on the current period and where we are going to and what we possibly could see. In terms of my own work, I kind of envisaged that at this point in time, a year after the pandemic, there would have been a combined struggle by workers and members of the community. My prediction was incorrect, that it turned out to be only in the sphere of reproduction. But of course, it also coincides with the fact that there has been a major, of course, struggle on the part of workers just to maintain their jobs. And so, of course, I think there is still a measured response from labor. And I think that will change in the coming period. And I think we will foresee another flow in terms of the workers' movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Chinguno, do you have any concluding remarks that you'd like to add?
Oh, okay, thanks, Eddie. I sort of like, in a way, to concur with Eddie, like in light of the current sort of like, in a way, crisis in terms of the pandemic that we are in, I think looking at it from other experiences, we have seen that maybe we should sort of like, in a way, maybe expect an upsurge in terms of the strike action maybe as we get out of the crisis at some point. And I draw this from the experience. I think the graph, the one that Eddie was showing, is quite very clear. Like, for example, there's quite seem to be at the end of a revolution or a struggle, in many cases, there's bound to be sort of like, in a way, a rise in terms of the demands in terms of the workers in the working class, in terms of the changes in terms of their conditions. So otherwise, thanks very much to Eddie, and then to all the other colleagues, and for very refreshing and very interesting sort of like work. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for the lively intellectual engagement that we had today. So this is the end of our webinar, but before I close, just to make a note that this Alternatives to Capitalism series continues. You'll also receive emails for the next event, which will happen on the 26th of August, to be presented by Professor Carl van Holt, who will be looking at corruption in South Africa. So once more, thanks everyone for taking your time. Thanks, Eddie, for the presentation. Thanks, Crispen, for those lovely remarks. And thanks, Tasneem, for handling the back end of the webinar. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.